It is my great pleasure to reintroduce Dr. Dmitry Gorenburg. Dmitry was very gracious a year ago, more than a year ago, on the 17th, something like that. A few days before the Russian invasion into Ukraine, Dmitry gave a laydown on what he anticipated would happen. And I must admit, I texted Dmitry shortly after the invasion started on the 24th of February in 2022 and said, with great pains, I have to say, you were right. Dmitry very graciously agreed to come back and give us a recap, sort of the looking back, what we've been through in the last year and what do we look at, what's going on moving forward. Dmitry has just returned from a meeting in Europe where this was the discussion among his colleagues there. And I'm very grateful, Dmitry, for you taking the time to come back to us and to fill us in on what's going on.
Thanks, Maureen, for having me back. What I'm going to try to do, I'll give you a little bit of a sense of both where we've gone through the war and what went wrong for Russia in terms of the invasion plans, and then kind of towards the end of what we're looking at and what's likely to happen next. So I'll begin with some initial goals. Over the past decade, as I'm sure you know, Russian Federation really made an effort to radically increase its military power. And as this military power grew, or at least its perception that it had grew, its foreign policy became more assertive. So there was a range of threats and intimidation through cyber attacks, nerve agent attacks on opponents, and also covert and overt military interventions. So we had the previous intervention in Ukraine in 2014, 2015. We had Syria. So there was kind of a whole set of these actions that then culminated in February's invasion of Ukraine. Now, it's clear to us now that Russia's initial invasion went quite poorly, and that things have not really improved that much in the subsequent year. With the war looking to continue for the foreseeable future, it's probably a little bit too early to provide an overall assessment of Russia's military performance, because things can still change. But we can make some preliminary assessments of the initial phases, kind of discuss what went wrong and what Russia's been doing since then to adjust that strategy. So that's kind of what I want to go over. In terms of the initial primary goals, there were really two. One was to have a firm say over Ukraine's foreign policy and internal governance, whether that was through annexation or just controlling Ukraine as a puppet state. I think it's unclear exactly what the preference was, but that was one goal. And the second goal was to block further NATO expansion, end Ukraine's defense cooperation with NATO members, and thereby weaken NATO, to kind of the world that NATO can't protect its clients as it's because Russian leaders saw Ukraine as a NATO client state, and therefore also sow division within NATO itself and between NATO and potential partners. That's the goals. Why 2022? I think there are a couple of reasons. One was Putin had been kind of thinking about this for some years. It's pretty clear now. And COVID isolated, right? He self-isolated. He narrowed his circle of people who had access to him to protect himself from COVID. But that meant that the people who previously had some ability to ameliorate some of his more anti-Western, more aggressive kind of tendencies were sidelined. And those people generally were the more economic advisor kind of people, right? So he mostly was people who had access to him in 2020, 2021 were the people from the security services who were closest to him. So that's one. The second aspect was perception in the Russian leadership that the West was weak and maybe weaker than it had been. And there were certain combination of factors that led to that. One was the departure of Angela Merkel, because Putin really saw her as a strong European leader, and her replacement as inexperienced and therefore weaker. Also, I think there was a real buy-in in the Russian leadership that in the belief that President Biden actually was too old, too senile, whatever it was. So there was this perception that the US leadership was also weak. And this was then confirmed for Russian leaders by the manner of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The fact of it and the manner of it, right? So the fact that the US was pulling back and then that it wasn't carried out particularly well. So that was kind of why, to my mind, Putin thought that early 2022 was a good time to launch this attack. And I think I may have shown this slide last time around, but this was the lineup of forces prior to the war. About 100 or so battalion tactical groups. So battalion tactical groups, about 600 to 800 people in their equipment, a bunch of support elements. So about probably more than half of Russia's total available ground force was moved near the Ukrainian border. This translated to maybe 80 to 100,000 regular combat troops. And then you kind of add in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, separatist forces, some of these mercenaries that we'll talk about later, like Wagner. So you probably get support elements, get to about 150,000 in terms of ground forces, plus the aerospace and naval units on top of that. They also had a pretty significant naval force set up in both the Black Sea and, as you can see, in the Eastern Med. But the Turkish closure of the Bosphorus meant that the forces in the Med couldn't then move into the Black Sea, so they were limited on that end. If we look at the initial war plan, the thing that stands out is the number and range of arrows, right? They're everywhere, right? Ukraine's a very large country, the largest in Europe after Russia, and they kind of wanted to attack all of it. So lightning strike on Kiev, moving from both the northeast and from Belarus, and then also the airborne attack on Hostomel that you've probably read about in the papers. And the expectation there was that with the Ukrainian leadership would then either flee or surrender or be killed, and they could do a regime change. So that was one part. The second part was taking over the south, moving out of Crimea, taking the key cities, Kherson and Mykolaiv, which is kind of it's not on this map, but it's halfway between Kherson and Odessa. And then you can press on to Odessa, probably combined with an amphibious landing. You can see that on this map as well. And then move on to and connect up with Transnistria, destabilizing Moldova along the way. And then the third part is in the east, where you surround the main Ukrainian military force that's been fighting in the Donbass by moving simultaneously from the north and kind of the east, right, or the sort of east and then turning north, so pincer movement there, and destroy that main Ukrainian army there. So how did this deviate from our expectations? Most analysts expected a longer period of an air campaign and a missile strike campaign before the start of the ground invasion, both to diminish the resistance and to establish air superiority by wiping out air defenses in the Ukrainian Air Force. And then after a few weeks of that, we thought there'd be a main fight, primarily in the east and the south, and then press on to Kiev after there were some successes there. Possibly the Kiev invasion would happen at the same time, but everyone pretty much thought there would be an air campaign first. And that obviously didn't happen. So in terms of what happened, hopefully you can see the map advancing here. This is that animation. You can see very significant territorial gains initially on all fronts in the first few weeks, but not as much as they expected. Again, it's a very large country, and they did actually, especially in the south, they did quite well. Particularly, they got bogged down near Kiev. So there were a lot of thunder runs, outrunning supply columns, and the result was a lack of food and ammunition to the Russian troops. In the south, they were stopped near Mykolaiv, and so they couldn't advance on Odessa or the north as they planned. In addition, the resistance in Mariupol pinned down a large number of Russian troops, so they couldn't move north against the Ukrainian military in the Donbass in that pincer movement like they expected. So what were the key Russian mistakes in this? One, they misjudged the Ukrainians. That's pretty clear. They expect a lot less resistance. They believed their own propaganda about Ukrainians treating them as liberators. And so that was one problem. I think they thought that in many cases, leaders in a lot of the regions would flip. And that really only happened in Kherson. Second mistake, not preparing their own troops. Most of the troops and some of the commanders had not been told that they would be invading Ukraine. Some were told they were participating in military exercise. Others were just told they were going to Eastern Donbass and that this was the big war. And so that meant they were psychologically unprepared to take casualties, and that kind of affected morale. So that was another mistake. Casualties were, as a result, much higher than they expected. Third mistake, insufficient logistics. The planners expected the war to last 2 to 3 weeks, and they didn't stock enough supplies for the longer fight, and they didn't have adequate plans for resupply. That was a big problem. They also started running out of precision weapons, and they resorted to indiscriminate shelling, which kind of lost whatever hearts and minds campaign they might have been thinking about. Another mistake, they failed to take out Ukraine's air defenses, partially because of that lack of an extended bombing campaign before the start of the war. And so that meant that they didn't have sufficient air support for ground operations. They couldn't dominate the skies. Another problem was that they were attacking on too many fronts. As I mentioned, they kind of neglected to consider the size of Ukraine. So they didn't have enough forces to really take over the territory that they wanted to take over as quickly as they could. There was also a lack of organization in terms of not having an overall commander for the whole operation. They had troops for multiple districts, and there was inability to kind of prioritize among all the different axes of attack. A couple more mistakes: using unsecured communications. So they were using old-fashioned radios and cell phones in some cases because their secure comms systems had failed. So Ukrainians were able to intercept their communications, create ambushes, target commanders, and so a disproportionate number. I think you probably all heard about the generals being killed early on in the war, but there were also a lot of mid-level commanders, sort of major and colonel level, that were killed, which again disorganizes the attack. There was an excessively centralized command structure. So Russia has a highly centralized military. It doesn't empower troops on the ground to make the decisions or issue orders. So troops that quickly ran into difficulty were unable to shift gears to adjust their new circumstances because they were awaiting orders from their superiors in district headquarters, or in some cases even in Moscow. This is a known problem. This was a known problem. We thought that they had solved this problem in training over the decade of reform, but clearly they hadn't. And finally, they kind of failed to have a plan B. So they weren't prepared for the level of resistance. They had no backup plan for what to do if their plans went awry. And so they kind of pressed on as originally ordered, driving into ambushes, and steadily getting killed by the Ukrainian forces. They didn't have enough infantry. They had skimped on the infantry side. So a lot of times armored convoys would be dispatched without infantry support, and that would make them easy targets for Ukrainians armed with portable anti-tank weapons such as javelins and so forth. So you end up with that ambush situation. So that was phase one, which, if you've been watching this map, kind of lasts through March. At that point, they realized their initial plan had failed and they revised. So what did they do? They withdrew completely from the north. That was a decision that was made by the Russian leadership, right? They were stopped, but then they just kind of withdrew without from the areas around Kiev and in the northeast, because that was where their supply lines were most strained and where they were facing the strongest counterattack. And then in the south, they dug in, trying to hold what they'd gained because they'd made some pretty rapid gains in the first few days. And then they focused on the Donbass. So that was plan B: conquer the Donbass. That would give Putin an achievement that he could claim as a victory. If you take all of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, it would match the originally announced war aims. They just kind of went back to the plan they already had for this region, which was to encircle Ukraine's main army in the region, moving in from the north and south. And you can kind of, if you look at this map, you can kind of see how that would work, right? And especially one of the advantages of encircling is that it's very difficult to move from the east to the west, because that's where the Ukrainian forces were dug in. They'd been fighting there for 8 years already. The idea was to use mass artillery strikes to hold the Ukrainian military in place in that area, and then other forces would create the pincer. But they couldn't do it, in part because a lot of forces were engaged in fighting in Mariupol against the holdout Azov battalion there, and so they couldn't fully create that pincer. And so they narrowed it again and just tried to create a pincer around Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. You can see that in the very far eastern part of the Ukrainian controlled territory on this map. And you can see that the progress here, there was progress for the Russian side, but it was pretty slow in this period of the war. They made this slow progress by using that massed artillery to destroy Ukrainian units or force them to retreat. And they had the advantage, the Russian side did, because they had more powerful artillery, but because of their manpower shortages at this point, because of the casualties and just because they weren't using mobilization at that point, Ukraine was, so the lack of infantry meant they couldn't turn that advantage into significant territorial gains. So they kept postponing the deadlines to take Severodonetsk, for example, because the advances were so slow. And both sides were taking very high casualties, exacerbating the manpower crisis. To some extent for both sides, but especially for Russia, again, because of that lack of mobilization. Meanwhile, another animation for showing this phase of the war, Ukraine launched its first counteroffensive near Kharkiv. So that's where they pushed Russia outside the artillery firing range of the city, and in some places they reached the border, and that was already like in June. And they slowly began to regain territory in the south. But in the summer, Ukraine didn't yet have the manpower or the weapons advantage to make a huge breakthrough. So they were focusing on retaking occupied territory on the right bank of the Dnieper, the west side. And it was kind of a slow advance. So it was infantry clearing territory no more than 1 or 2 kilometers a day, that sort of thing. That's kind of phase 2. And then phase 3 comes in, and that's the Ukrainian counteroffensive, you'll remember from the fall. Began in earnest in late August. Longer range Western weapons, particularly HIMARS, allowed Ukrainian forces to target Russian ammunition and fuel supply centers. So in addition to affecting the availability of ammunition and fuel directly, it also strained Russian logistics because it made resupply more difficult. They had to transport the supplies longer distances, often by road rather than rail. So that was part of the issue. There was also a morale boosting component, especially with strikes on some symbolic targets like the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. The combination of the damage to the Russian supply lines and Russia's manpower shortage allowed Ukraine to break through Russian lines in September in several regions. The first I'll talk about is the surprise attack in Kharkiv. So if you go back, if you remember August, there was a lot of kind of promotion of a coming offensive in Kherson, a very different part of the country, right? So Russia transferred a lot of its best troops to that area. And Kharkiv was left pretty, the part of Kharkiv Oblast that was occupied, the northeast on the left side of this on the left map here, was pretty lightly defended with pretty low quality troops, and there was almost no second line. So Ukraine noticed, Intel saw this, and they launched a surprise attack. Part of this was the advantage of having interior lines versus exterior lines, so they could move troops much faster within Ukraine versus Russia's distances were much longer. So this led to a rout and a rapid Russian retreat that liberated, as you can see on the right side, most of the occupied parts of the region in just a few days. And I've been told by some folks that have been on the ground in the region that the reason the Ukrainians stopped where they did was that they started to run out of ammo, and that was why they didn't kind of keep pressing. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've been told by Western people who were been working with the Ukrainians at that time. So the Russian troops kind of pulled back to the border in the north, as you can see, and then to the Donets River in the east. The other thing that they did as a second part of this counterattack was a concurrent offensive in Kherson and in the Luhansk region. In Luhansk, they just went around that Donets River defensive line, liberated Liman and Yampil, and they kind of now put the supply lines for Severodonetsk under threat. Also liberated Izum eventually as well. In Kherson, they liberated the northern part of the right bank, and that increased the threat of Russian forces in Kherson city being entirely cut off from retreat. So that eventually, later on in the fall, forced Russia to withdraw from Kherson because the alternative was unacceptable losses and potentially losing both people and equipment. And then those withdrawn troops were redeployed to Donbass and also to strengthen the defenses in Zaporizhia. You can just see that withdrawal was very deliberate and pretty well actually carried out pretty effectively. I'll say a little bit more about the current situation in a minute, but just to kind of summarize on where those phases 2 and 3, a couple of important things. The effect of Western weapons. So that allowed, Western assistance allowed Ukraine to replenish pretty scarce supplies. They were using up a lot of ammunition, a lot of artillery, a lot of tanks and armored vehicles, and all the rest. They also took in a lot of captured Russian weapons and ammo as well, especially in the northeast. So that was one. The longer ranges of the Western weapons meant that more Russian targets became vulnerable. That complicated the supply lines. Russia has adjusted to this over time, but initially it was quite disruptive. But they still needed more, as we've been hearing in the news, more armor and artillery to be able to actually pursue an offensive now. I'll get to why in a second. There were also a number of additional symbolic acts, and here are the famous Ukrainian stamps, the Moskva sinking. So first of all, of course, they increased morale, but they also had practical advantages. So the sinking of the Moskva made the Black Sea Fleet move farther away. That eliminated the threat of an amphibious landing for good. Also, kind of just marginally affected the ranges of their precision guided missiles. Not too. I mean, just in terms of like the farthest north. Ukraine took over Snake Island, which meant an additional loss of air defense sensors. So that also complicated their naval side. So the Russian Navy, as a result, was limited to long-range strikes and blockade enforcement. The Kerch Bridge symbolism is pretty obvious. Although the bridge was never completely out of commission, it did complicate Russian logistics in the short term. Ostensibly, in response to this attack, the Russian military switched tactics and began to target civilian infrastructure for primarily electricity generation. I'm sure you're familiar with that. I suspect that attack was actually a response to the territorial losses and was already being planned before the Kerch Bridge attack. That was just an excuse that they used to implement it. Now, the Ukrainian air defense has reduced the effectiveness of these missile strikes. About 50 to 80% of the missiles get shot down, maybe 3/4 or so of the drones as well. The other problem for Russia is that they don't have the missiles to sustain this level of attack forever. And we've now seen this. They're pretty much just using the missiles they produce. So it's why the frequency has been cut down from weekly to about once a month at this point with the missiles. And this is also why they're buying Iranian drones, which are certainly a threat to Ukrainian infrastructure, even though they really don't have much effect on the battlefield. It's one of those problems where the drones are much cheaper to make than the air defense weapons that are used to take them down, right? So if you can just kind of overwhelm with numbers. So as long as the war continues, I expect there to be more of these kind of strikes on major cities away from the front line as a way for the Russian leadership to highlight the insecurity of all Ukrainians in order to undermine the support for continuing the war effort. Although the historical record shows that these kinds of campaigns are usually kind of a last resort and they're pretty ineffective at actually breaking resistance. The other thing I should mention is mobilization in Russia, right? So this was announced on September 21st, a partial mobilization of about 300,000 troops, plus, and perhaps more importantly, a stop-loss program. So contract soldiers who are already fighting in the Russian military could no longer just pull out if they didn't want to keep fighting. I won't get into the political aspects. So there were some protests. A lot of young men certainly left Russia. You're probably familiar with that. More importantly, for describing the war effort, say a little bit about how they've been used. About half the force, half of that 300,000, was immediately sent to the front lines to kind of plug gaps. And even though they're largely untrained or very poorly trained, the idea was that they would still slow down any advance because Ukrainian forces would have to deal with them, right? Even if they're surrendering, you still have to deal with them. And that certainly worked. The other half were held back and trained in preparation for a future offensive, which is what we have right now. It's not really a game changer, mobilization, but what it did do is it ended Ukraine's manpower advantage and it slowed Ukraine's advances and it kind of allowed that winter offensive to take place. And we've seen the impact on the line of control, which became much more stable, more similar to the situation in April through June, where there was kind of somewhere between a stalemate to slow Russian gains, right, is what we're seeing. So Russia's strategy at this point was a combination of the following: signaling that they're in it for the long haul, they won't back down. That was the annexation of 4 Ukrainian provinces in the south and east in September, making it painful for Ukraine by targeting our infrastructure, making it painful for Europe by targeting energy supplies. Fortunately for Europe, they had prepared, and 2, it's been a warm winter. Make the publics in the West afraid with various nuclear threats. And they've kind of dialed that up and down over time. Encourage political divisions in the US and Europe to kind of promote the isolationists and that sort of thing on both left and right. So you have the isolationists on one side, kind of peace at any cost progressives on the other side, but they're all helpful for Russian policy. And hope that these factors together push the West and Ukraine to the negotiating table where they can lock in the gains and maybe then use a breather to rebuild for potential future rounds of conflict. So where are we now? These are those ISW maps that Maureen mentioned. Several months of stalemate have followed the withdrawal from Kherson. Russia's made some marginal gains near Bakhmut. You've probably been hearing about. Ukraine has made equally marginal gains in the north, in Luhansk, near Crimea, the Svatova line. Neither is really significant in terms of the big picture strategic position. In January, Russia began its offensive using increase in manpower that I mentioned to press its advantage. They don't care as much about casualties, so that they're likely to continue this. As a result, they've made some marginal gains in the east, but I don't think much more will come of it. I think that, what we've seen is a fair bit of failure in terms of actual significant advances for Russia. Ukraine is also advantageous for Ukraine in a way that Russia has gone first. Ukraine will probably launch its own counteroffensive in the spring, most likely in the south, once this Russian offensive is exhausted and Ukraine has had time to assimilate the new Western equipment and training. These advances are likely to be slower than in the fall because Russian forces have fewer manpower problems and they're more dug in. But there's always a chance of a breakthrough. So, I don't think it's hopeless by any means. And then the subsequent developments will depend on the extent of continued Western support for Ukraine and the extent to which Ukraine feels that it can continue to make further territorial gains on the battlefield. So that relates directly to the key factors shaping the conflict, which are the balance of forces on the battlefield, one, and the extent of Western resolve in continuing to fund it and equip Ukraine, two, because Ukraine really does depend on this assistance, both in terms of equipment and financing. And then the third factor, which I think is less important, is the extent to which the Russian public and political elites continue to be supportive of Russia's war effort, or at least apathetic for the public. I believe that the chances of domestic pressure forcing policy change are pretty low, but they're not zero. So that's why I include it, because there is some chance. And finally, last thing I'll talk about is I was at the Marshall Center last week talking a little bit about future scenarios. So this is kind of what happens in the next phases of the war. And we came up with 5. So I'll just briefly lay them out and stop. And these are kind of in decreasing order of likelihood from my point of view. The first is Ukraine continues to make territorial gains, albeit at a slower pace than in the fall. So Western resolve remains unshaken, but Russia refuses to admit defeat. And so the war continues in largely the same manner as it has been in recent weeks or months, let's say. The second is the stalemate option. So Russian mobilization has sufficiently alleviated the manpower shortage to prevent Ukraine from making further territorial gains in 2023. So the war kind of settles into a static attritional conflict. And that leads to increased pressure to formalize a ceasefire along existing lines of control. I think of this as kind of like the Korean War scenario. But if you remember the Korean War, it took a couple of years after the lines were pretty settled for them to actually get to an armistice. Third option is escalation. So additional Russian defeats increase pressure on Putin, leading to some kind of escalation. Probably not nuclear, although I don't think we can completely rule that out. And this leads to greater Western resolve and also more discomfort among key neutral parties such as China and India. So there's more pressure on Russia to end the war, but it's unclear how Russia responds to such a thing. The next one is a successful Russian counteroffensive that leads to more territorial gains down the road, and then a stalemate thereafter along the lines described in that scenario. And then the last one is a deterioration of Western support for Ukraine that leads to pressure to enter into negotiations and admit the loss of territory. That may rise over time if you go in several years, but at least in the next year or two, I don't think that's very likely. So hopefully this has been helpful. I'll stop there and pass it on back to Maureen and on to the discussants.
Excellent. Thank you, Dmitry. That was tour de force walk through where we are. And also the realism that this is a long haul. Our NSF members all have long memories of long wars. And unfortunately, the Ukraine war is stacking up to be on par with some of the longer wars that we've fought. And the Ukrainians obviously are in this for the long haul. So thank you very much for that. We're very honored to have John Woodworth join us. John is with the Council on Foreign Relations in Charlottesville. And I asked John explicitly to address the issue about negotiations and what the prospects were for the possible future of negotiations. I do regret that Professor Barbara Walker is not able to join us today. She's our Russian history expert and has spoken to this group before. Unfortunately, Barbara is suffering from a severe bout of long COVID. And so she said she wasn't up for the presentation today, but we are very honored to have Susan Malone join us. And Susan will be addressing some of the points about the war crimes issues. And during the anniversary events recently in the last week, many people have heard lots of discussions about the prospect of Russia being held to account for war crimes and the war on aggression. So with that, John, I'm going to turn it to you to give us a few words.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And Dmitry, I enjoyed your summary, but in particular, your concluding scenarios. So what I'm asked to talk about a bit is bearing on those scenarios, but specifically on the question of negotiations and as they relate to end of war of scenarios. For a long time, it was difficult to contemplate them seriously, but it's less true now, I think, as we enter the second year of the war, because how this war ends has taken on an increasing urgency. So here we're dealing with the realm of unknowns. But it seems to me that as we think about this in shaping policy, it's essential to have a clear idea of what we want to achieve in the wake of the war, something beyond just ending the conflict and bloodshed. The war, in my view, will not end well for Ukraine without a successful negotiation. Historical analogies are interesting in this thing, but we can turn those later if we wish. But for now, there are 4 topics. Let me try to touch on them as quickly as I can. Timing, conditions, format, and substance. We could talk a long time about each of these, but I'll see what I can do in about a minute on each, if that's possible. So on timing, there are no prospects for negotiations right now. And indeed, the conventional wisdom is that Putin has not changed his goals, which extend well beyond the annexation of occupied Ukrainian territory. But the further conventional wisdom is that the war will end in negotiations. When that occurs matters, because the longer the conflict drags on, the more difficult the reconstruction of Ukrainian society, economy, and politics becomes. Seems to me the oft-spoken pledge of as long as it takes does not capture the imperative of getting to a satisfactory outcome sooner than later. We need a corollary that better states the goal of achieving early results that secures genuine peace. Well, which leads to the second topic, which are the conditions that could lead to negotiations and a satisfactory endgame. Frankly, this boils down to whether Ukraine is in a position to gain an upper hand militarily. This will require decisive military assistance for Ukraine, with emphasis on rapid delivery and integration of critical weapons and support. I would say that US and European performance over the past year has not been optimal. The question is, can that change? Now, it may not be necessary for President Zelensky's goal of driving Russia completely out of Ukraine. It may be sufficient to break Russia's momentum decisively enough to force recognition that they have no hope of holding the ground that they have occupied, and that negotiations are preferable to outright defeat. Talks can begin while fighting still goes on. And indeed, negotiations could be about the withdrawal of Russian troops, which brings up the topic of format. Let me touch very quickly on 3 variations on this. The first are direct talks between the Ukraine and Russia. We had some experience with this early on in the war, in March of 22, when the parties sat down across the table from each other only briefly and with zero results, of course. But it's possible that a bilateral negotiation of some sort could be arranged with representatives of each side who could try to hammer out the terms of at least a preliminary agreement. We know now, of course, that Zelensky and Putin both refused to talk to each other. Well, the second would be to accept the engagement of a mediator. This was tried with success in Istanbul last March, and again, even in May. But this method has been used on secondary issues like the deal on grain shipments and over the exchange of prisoners. However, engaging a mediator on the larger goal of an enduring settlement raises delicate choices. Ideas that have emerged are the UN Secretary General, Erdogan of Turkey, India, or even some combination of Gulf states. Now, China has entered the picture with its 12-point plan. The issue here is the degree to which Kiev would be prepared to place some measure of control of negotiations in the hands of an honest broker. Well, the third approach would be an international forum, convened to reach a broad-based settlement of the war. Zelensky has spoken favorably of this idea, although the details of such a forum have not been spelled out. The idea has the attraction of engaging key players like the US and EU, who frankly must inevitably have a hand in the terms of any viable settlement. Finally, this brings us to the content of negotiations. Let me try to be quick. This is the most important issue because the terms for ending the war are critical in the short and long terms. In this context, a ceasefire other than a subset of broader-based negotiations holds the greatest risks for Ukraine. A stalemate or frozen conflict would have similar effects. With either of these, Russia will remain free to renew hostilities and continue to intervene internally in Ukraine. So beyond any ceasefire, what then could be the substance of genuine peace talks? The 10 points set out by President Zelensky in October, I think, provide an excellent starting point for negotiations. Obviously, Zelensky thinks so. Russia has rejected them out of hand, but that is all the more reason for Ukraine to hold to them. The points are entirely reasonable on their face. They illustrate the content of any thorough and lasting agreement must address. Very quickly, the key elements. First and foremost, the issue of territory. President Zelensky is clear on this. He's insisting on the complete return of all territory occupied since 2014. However, there's been a long-running debate on Ukraine trading land for peace. Crimea has been at the center of this, a wide range of opinions. In March of last year, Ukraine dangled the idea of putting aside the disposition of Crimea for 15 years, leaving it subject to subsequent resolution. For now, the US and EU have left the question of territory for Kiev to decide. But there are ample indications of behind-the-scenes discussions in Washington and in European capitals on what sort of deals could serve the interests of Ukraine and its allies. Okay, next, reparations must be resolved. Russia cannot escape responsibility for the vast destruction it has caused in Ukraine. Russian bank accounts that are now frozen should be part of reparations, but further payments by Russia will be needed. The burden of reconstruction should not be left solely to the West. Next, guarantees for Ukraine's security. Early ideas of a neutral Ukraine are off the table. Among necessary terms, there must be commitments from Russia to formally end the war and to maintain peaceful relations with Ukraine. There must be recognition of Ukraine's right to join the EU, and an acceptable settlement must also include the right of Ukraine to armaments for self-defense, perhaps demilitarized frontiers, and security guarantees by allies of Ukraine. And finally, the right of Ukraine to join defense agreements, including membership in NATO, should not be precluded. Additionally, among key elements of a settlement must be justice, holding Russia accountable for human rights violations and aggression. Susan Malone will discuss this critical part of any settlement. The remaining elements of Zelensky's 10 points, radiation and nuclear safety, food security, energy security, release of prisoners and civilian deportees, environmental protection, are all vital and legitimate issues for negotiation. There is some overlap in Zelensky's 10 points and the 12-point plan China has announced. And indeed, Zelensky has said recently, in the last few days, that he's looking at the China plan. Obviously, and let me try to conclude quickly, a settlement with Zelensky's 10 points is far removed from what Russia currently seeks. Any negotiation involves trade-offs, but there must be clear recognition of the consequences of falling short of Ukraine's goals. Finally, we cannot ignore thinking through what kind of incentives can be offered to Russia. Among these could be the relaxation and eventual removal of sanctions, restoration of broader economic opportunities, freedom of movement of people, transportation, and other measures. And more broadly, a new security architecture for Europe could be discussed, drawing on the existing institutions and agreements in the OSCE, and perhaps the resurrection of CEF-type arms control measures. Well, to conclude, we could debate indefinitely whether Russia in its current incarnation is even remotely capable of a settlement with these features. Ultimately, a durable settlement requires Russia to abandon imperial ambitions and decide that its interests are best served, and I emphasize its interest, it's got to redefine its interests, are best served by a peaceful and constructive relationship with its neighbors and beyond. We can have no illusions that this will be easy or certain, but it is necessary to seek to build with Russia a better path forward. Finally, one starting point is to decisively reject Russia's propaganda charges that the West seeks to divide and destroy Russia. Well, there are many points there that we can all discuss. Let me leave it at that. And Maureen, turn it over back to you.
Thank you, John. That was a really helpful summary of where we are and lays out several options that are probably going to be really challenging, but it does definitely mean that this is a complex process for negotiations that's going to take quite a while. I have lots of questions, but I still want to get to the crux of a lot of the discussion that's been going on for the last several weeks, and that's how eventually will Russia be held accountable. And there has been lots of discussions about the war crimes issue. So it is a great honor to be able to have Susan Malone join us because she had firsthand experience working with the Bosnian War Crimes Tribunal and understands the issues of how do you hold not only individuals, but leadership of countries accountable for atrocities during war. So with that, Susan.
Thank you. Good morning. What I'd like to do is talk about war crimes investigations in the Ukraine. But first of all, let me sort of set a stage. I will talk about the International Criminal Court, briefly how it's organized and what role it plays today. I will talk about some of the background and some of the issues within the Ukraine as far as issues of war crimes. Let me first start off by saying that there are about 11 war crimes that we look at internationally. I was very fortunate to be a senior United Nations diplomat and an investigator with the Office of the Prosecutor for former Yugoslavia. That tribunal was set up by the United Nations Security Council. It came out of the Dayton Accords in 1996. The court sat in The Hague. We had investigative jurisdiction throughout the former Yugoslavia. We had subcourts that dealt with Rwanda and then dealt with the issues in Timor dealing with war crimes. The court was made up of international investigators, a panel of judges run through the United Nations precepts. There's 11 war crimes that we look at. Crimes against humanity. It's a broad topic, but it includes murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, systematic rape, and sexual enslavement in a time of war. Now, that particular category was added during my time with the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia because of the systematic and the massive rapes that occurred. So we had that then added under the UN Charter as a war crime. Other inhumane acts, we looked at prosecutions on the political, racist, or religious grounds, the execution that connected with any of those crimes and other crimes against humanity. So those were the issues, sort of a broad spectrum. The International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction now, let me share with you very briefly so you'll know an introduction or something about the court. The International Criminal Court, which also sits in The Hague, investigates and where warranted will try individuals charged with the greatest war crimes or crimes that concern international community, include genocide, the various war crimes that I discussed, crimes against humanity, and crimes of aggression. So that court then is the court of last resort. It seeks to gather the facts, and it does not replace national courts. If there's a functioning government and those national courts have the statutes, and whether there are civil statutes, there are criminal statutes, or for the United States, it'd be the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It would be the Articles of War. Those crimes then are tried if the government still stands and brings those charges. But the International Court looks at the individuals and the countries involved that commit these crimes or order the crimes to be committed. And really, for the first time in history of humankind, the states got together. There's 120 nations that met in Rome, the Rome Accords that signed the treaty and the agreements for the International Criminal Court. What I'd like to do now, that sort of sets the court and what they do. I can come back later and answer questions, but let me turn to the Ukraine, because that's the topic of the day. Less than a week after the Russian invasion of the Ukraine in February of 2022, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced that it would be opening investigations into whether war crimes had been committed. Of course, the Ukrainians had information, the civilians coming out of the Ukraine, bringing information about the war crimes. The fact that the Russian armed forces in the Ukraine are operating within a clearly defined chain of command, and that led to the Kremlin really removing one important obstacle to a prosecution, because they did have a clear chain of command that served as a stumbling block in other investigations by the court. The chief prosecutor will probably attempt to indict several senior Russian officers on war crime charges or other crimes against humanity. And we're waiting to see that is still in process. There's investigators on the ground. There's forensic scientists, forensic teams on the ground, looking at all of the mass grave sites. On March the 2nd, 2022, the chief prosecutor talked about opening investigations really of past and present allegations of war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. One of the issues that they looked at, Mariupol, when the Russians bombed a theater that had more than 600 civilians. These are non-combatants that were sheltering in place, and they knew it was a non-combatant facility. The Ukrainians were not using it as an observation post or a firing point. These were civilian non-combatants, men, women, and children, mostly women and children, that were systematically bombed by the Russians. So that is one of the crimes. They're looking at people that have been taken out in some of the cities that were captured, that were the mayors of the towns, people that were systematically executed, that were beaten, tortured, and then executed and then hastily buried. So those grave sites are being investigated. 10 months into the Russian invasion, the ICC has really gathered extensive evidence that shows the Kremlin troops have waged a total war with disregard to the international laws dealing with non-combatants or combatants that have laid down their arms, that have surrendered. So they're looking at many of those issues. And the civilians, also the kidnapping of civilians, especially children. Recently, if you saw in the news, the Russians were showing a ceremony or an event in Russia, and there were all these little children, young children, that were from the Ukraine. They were kidnapped. And so, many of the people in the Ukraine and some of the displaced people were identifying their children or their neighbors' children that were then kidnapped and taken into Russia. So those are many of the issues that are being looked at. The treatment of civilians, the conduct on the battlefield, the conduct of the Ukrainians recently tried a Russian soldier who was captured, who had murdered a civilian. The young soldier admitted to it, just executed a civilian for no reason. And he admitted to that. He was tried and convicted. Originally, he received a life sentence. This was in the Ukrainian courts. Some of the evidence was supported by the ICC on this person being murdered. Then the Ukrainian courts, their appellate courts looked at those charges and they reduced his sentence for a variety of reasons. So that is one conviction that was undertaken by the Ukrainian courts, but the ICC is on the ground, again, gathering information and looking at some of those mass war crimes with the Ukrainians, with their assistance. There's about 58,000 potential Russian war crimes that are killings, kidnappings, indiscriminate bombings that I talked about. I showed Mariupol, sexual assaults, rapes, gang rapes. These are being investigated by the ICC. They've pretty much identified independently more than 600 incidents that appear to violate the laws of war. And some of these attacks were massacres where dozens of people and hundreds of civilians were taken out and shot, taken out of their homes. They were brutalized. The looting is also a crime. So they're looking at the systematic looting by the Russian soldiers. Some of these issues are very critical, and it's a total war effort by the Russians against a population, not just an armed combatant armed force. Their war is directed at a civilian population to break the will of that civilian population. So many of these reasons are manifold. The Ukrainian authorities really face serious challenges in getting airtight evidence in a war zone. That was difficult. It was difficult in the former Yugoslavia. We spent many years on the ground documenting the mass graves and the war crimes in the former Yugoslavia. We identified people who gave the commands. I investigated the tier 1 war criminals. We arrested them. They were taken back to The Hague and tried, and they were convicted. But it took many years. It just didn't happen within 1 or 2 years. A successful prosecution, even a successful prosecution, there's really the limits of justice. You really have to look at these individuals carefully and make sure that there is a justice, that they have their defense team in place that can look at the evidence, challenge the evidence, ask questions. So these are some of the things that are going on today in the ICC to document and examine these issues. Again, I said it's very difficult. The Russian commanders are really sort of out of reach of the ICC. We had an easier time, took many years to arrest the tier 1 war criminals. We had to hunt them down, but it's hard to go into Russia and arrest some colonel or general who's given orders where there's a clear chain of command or a clear on the scene commander that knows these crimes are taking place and doesn't put a stop to them, and that they don't have a system of justice to deal with these war crimes within their own system. I would say that the issues with Russia, that they're under Putin. Some of the issues are that he's ignored many of these rules that were established by the Geneva Conventions. There's many Geneva Conventions dating back to 1907 and that begin to build the foundation for the war crimes that are under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court today. Some people may ask, the United States is not a signatory of the Rome protocols for the International Court. And our issues for the United States, we basically look to it and we say that because we have a system of justice, we have not only the Uniform Code of Military Justice for the armed combatants, our soldiers, we also have Title 18 U.S. Code 2441, which is a specific code and a section that deals with the war crimes. It deals with the offenses, it deals with the investigations, and it deals with the punishments. So we do have a system in place. We also won't allow some extraterritorial country to come in and arrest a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil for an alleged violation of the War Crimes Act. We will investigate that, and that person will be tried. One of the things that the International Court, there's a panel of judges that hear the case, both the prosecution and the defense. There is no trial by jury. Some of the trials aren't publicly open. Many of the issues have to deal with a violation of our Constitution as far as right to trial by jury, a public speedy trial, and the arrest of a U.S. person on U.S. soil without the Department of Justice or our legal people dealing with extradition and dealing with some of these other issues. They just can't come in and snatch and grab someone on our soil. Those are some of the issues and some of the reasons we haven't signed that Rome Accord. However, we do cooperate. We have an observer. We have a United Nations Assistant Secretary of Defense for war crimes. We have staffs that deal and work closely with the International Criminal Court and criminal investigations in The Hague to help document, especially individuals that worked for the former court for the Yugoslavia. There's a lot of experience, and we lend that experience as far as our forensics teams and how we document and put together a criminal case to take to the ICC. So there is work going on now. There's teams on the ground. They're trying to gather the information, find witnesses, find survivors, document what happened, when it happened, and who the perpetrators are. It's a difficult task. It's a very sad task to deal with the killing, mass killings of innocents. We call them innocents on the battlefield, or somebody who was a combatant who has surrendered and is no longer considered a combatant, a hostile force, and the systematic destruction of a people, of a town, of a religious facility, of individuals that are not combatants. So that shares with you what's going on in the Ukraine today as far as the investigations for war crimes. It's a difficult subject. And again, the international community is going forward and gathering that evidence in support of the Ukraine to document those cases.
Thank you, Susan. I really appreciate that. It is a very solemn topic, and I know a lot of people have been interested in following this. It is also a very long and drawn out process, but war crimes can be held accountable, as Susan mentioned, in the former Yugoslavia, and there's a strong commitment from the world to do that now. Okay. I have lots of questions, so I'm going to bounce it back and forth between the questions I can see on my phone and the questions that you just handed me. So I'm going to start out, Dmitry, if you can be ready for this one. I'm going to shorten this because I have several versions of it, but I'm going to shorten it to with or China. What's the impact of China's area? And thank you, John, for mentioning the China peace plan, if you will. But what is China's role and what can we expect China to be doing? And then following on to that, I know this is a little bit of a extension, but what does this mean for China vis-a-vis Taiwan, the whole war issues? So Dmitry, you're up first.
Thanks for that. And I'll just caveat with saying I'm not a China expert. I'm a Russia expert, but I have been working a fair bit on Russian-Chinese military cooperation from the Russian perspective. China is, I think, uncomfortable with some of the potential effects. You see a lot of the time kind of people saying, well, China's the winner here. I'm not so sure, and I'll explain. First of all, China is now in this difficult position where it didn't want to be, of having to either back off its partnership with Russia or find its economic ties with Europe and the US under some threat because of the sanctions regimes and so forth. That's not to China's advantage. Russia wants to change the world order. China wants to increase its position in the existing world order. The war is, in that sense, not necessarily in China's interest, particularly a war where its partner is losing, or at least not winning. So China has been trying to thread that needle by doing things like presenting peace plans and trying. The one thing that's maybe worse for China than the current situation is an actual Russian defeat. If Russia is seen as no longer being able to provide the resources for China to kind of have its back in a way in various disputes with the West, because they do kind of have this kind of partnership in those international fora, that hurts China. So I think China will do the least that it can to make sure that Russia isn't completely defeated. But what does that mean in practice? I think that they've shown an unwillingness to provide actual military assistance. There's been some discussion of this in public in the last couple of weeks. My sense is that if there is assistance, it'll be kind of through back channels and kind of underhanded ways rather than anything open. The other thing is that I think Chinese leaders have made it pretty clear that use of nuclear weapons is unacceptable for them. On the question of Taiwan and the lessons learned, if anything, my guess, again, I'm not a China expert, but I would venture, and consistent with things I've read by people who are experts, is that it's made them somewhat more cautious, because they see, first of all, that the West can be more united than they expected, that they can implement sanctions that are painful to themselves, the West that is, and also that military forces that seem very powerful on paper may not end up so. So that all of those factors, I think, lead towards greater caution. That doesn't mean that they renounce any chance of a military attack on Taiwan. I don't think that's the case. In that balance of, can we do this? What will be the costs and benefits of that? There's some recalculation.
Excellent. Thank you, Dmitry. John, on the negotiations, questions about whether or not the Ukraine is going to condition the negotiations either on NATO membership or on security guarantees. And if the latter, what are security guarantees?
That's a good question. I don't think that Ukraine would necessarily condition an otherwise satisfactory negotiation on Ukraine entry into NATO. I do think they would not want to see any provision that precluded that in the future. But what President Zelensky has talked about so far has been security guaranteed. And he thinks, I think justifiably so, that Ukraine requires for any secure future guarantees from its allies, the US and Europe. And the form that that could take is not necessarily, and especially in any near term, membership in NATO. The US and Europeans could offer security assistance, declarations of willingness to come to Ukraine's assistance if they are threatened in the future, and in particular, perhaps direct assistance by either the US or European members if Ukraine is again subject to an invasion or a threat or a serious military threat. There has been this recent discussion of the European group discussing and raising ideas of security guarantees for Ukraine, in part as an encouragement to Ukraine to engage in negotiations. They seem to have in mind, though, some kinds of trade-offs of land for peace without defining exactly what that would be.
Thank you, John. Yeah, that's a sticky question. We've heard a lot about security guarantees, and I think watch this space as we try and define that, particularly post-war Ukraine. Dmitry, I'm going to bounce back to you before I go turn to Susan for a few questions. How is the current situation that we're seeing, or the quasi, not quite stalemate situation that we're seeing right now, how is that different from the Eastern Front in World War II? And are we looking at something that's comparable to what we lived through in World War II on that side?
World War II was, I think, more movement. There were periods of World War I that were more trench warfare, this kind of thing. What looks like a stalemate at any given point may turn into not a stalemate. We all thought last summer that we were headed for a stalemate, and then the Ukrainians proved that they can retake territory, right? So I wouldn't prejudge where we are right now. I think the community of people who've been analyzing the war, we've been saying we'll know a lot more in 3 to 6 months, let's say, depending on how this next phase of dueling counteroffensive, let's put it that way, goes, right? We're already, I think, getting a pretty good sense of the limits of Russia's attacks, but we don't yet know whether Ukraine can successfully take territory or not. We'll have a lot more clarity by June or so.
Excellent. Thank you. Yeah, as the counteroffensive continue, we'll find out whether this is trench warfare or just a pause. To Susan, excellent question about, can the courts in their current composition, the international courts, presumably, find leadership in Russia, in particular Putin, guilty? And then the follow-on question is, what happens if there's a succession in Russia? Supposing Putin somehow or another gets toppled, do the people who come in, are they also held accountable for what's going on?
I can refer you back to the situation in the former Yugoslavia. One of the things that we looked at was the trail of evidence. You follow the evidence, you follow the trail, and the senior leaders, Croats, the Bosniaks, as well as the Serbians, none of them had clean hands. And the leadership gave many of the orders to commit the wholesale slaughter of individuals. General Mladic, and Srebrenica is a perfect example where he gathered up all the Bosnians and he marched them out of the city. There was a small contingent of United Nations personnel that were armed with, basically their sidearms and light weapons. And their orders were, they were there as observers, and there was really a handful of them. So the general massacred between 3,000 and 6,000 of the Bosnians that were Muslim, men, women, and children. So when the killing fields were looked at and examined and evidence was collected, then that evidence went toward finding out what orders Mladic gave. So one of the things about written orders or telegraphed orders, verbal communications, who gave what order and when was it given? What orders were given by Putin and his general staff, or given by Putin to his general staff, to the field commanders. So all that evidence is gathered. Was there orders given for the systematic destruction of a people, of civilians, or the bombing of the theater in Metropole? Were there orders given? Who gave the orders? And so we examine that and find out what orders were given from Putin on down through the chain of command. And the courts would attempt to gather that information through many forms. I mean, signals intelligence, and some of those signals are gathered. So there's a way, and orders were given, written orders that were communicated through military channels. So those would be gathered. So they look at that very carefully to find out, is there a trail? You look at the paper trail. It's like following the money. You follow what is done and who were the senior people that ordered the actions to be taken. So the courts will look at that, then decide if Putin is removed or toppled or displaced, then you'd have to look at who his replacements are, and then what was their role? What role did they play in the actions taken for the alleged war crimes that were committed? What did they do, or what did they not do? Did they make any attempt to give advice not to do that? Our military is trained the law of land warfare. We have very specific rules, and there's military lawyers with every field commander and every commander down probably to the battalion level, at least from my experience. And classes are given, our armed forces are taught repeatedly about the rules of land warfare, the rules of the conduct of war, what is not an acceptable target, what is off limits. So that's all looked at very carefully. The rules of engagement, what we call ROE, are laid out very clearly to the military. So all those things would be taken into consideration. What did the Russians do? Do they have a system? Are their people trained? Are they retrained? And then if someone commits an act, then how are they dealt with? So that would be what would be viewed by the ICC, and it's a tribunal of judges, international judges, that then would examine the evidence. The prosecutor's office puts the evidence together, and then the judges decide if there's information that's consistent it's indictable. So we gave out war crime indictments.
Thank you very much, Susan. Yeah, again, this is going to be a tough throw to look at holding those accountable, from the soldiers on the battlefield to the leadership. Dmitry, I'm going to give you a tough one, and John, you're welcome to chime in afterwards. This is a really well-written question. I'm going to read the question, which I rarely do. It seems some of the big battle is for the hearts and minds of the neutral countries between respect for sovereignty and democratic rule and the authoritarian model of Russia, Iran, North Korea, and China. How do you read the sentiment of the neutral countries, and what are the best moves the West can make to be best positioned in the longer competition?
If you look at the countries that have enacted sanctions on Russia, it's, I think, something like 60% of the world economy, but it's only 34 countries, maybe like something like 30% of the population, something like that. So you do have this large set of countries that are in the, let's say, the global South, that are much more uncertain about the war, and they have a different interpretation. There's some media reports I've seen that are like, well, these countries are sympathetic to Putin, or they like authoritarianism. I don't think that's exactly it. I think it's more that a lot of these leaders, and also populations to some extent, perceive the West and the United States as still having imperialist legacies. And so they are skeptical of the reasons that the US leaders and European leaders give for what they're doing in Ukraine. And they don't think that it's just, oh, we're standing up for all that is good and right. They're more accepting of the argument that this is an effort to preserve Western control and Western influence in the world. They also, let's say, would like to revise the world order, maybe not by the means, mostly not by the means that Russia has been using, but they do see a disparity. So what moves does the West then need to take to change that? It has to do mostly with presenting the West as a more attractive partner. Also, really highlighting the conflict as an attack on national sovereignty of Ukraine, right? Because that's something that leaders the world over understand, would potentially feel threatened by. If we're talking about liberalism or good governance or those kinds of things, that's something that may not resonate everywhere, certainly among some of the authoritarian neutral countries. If any country that has power can just go and attack another country and take some of their territory and annex it, and then have that be recognized, then everyone is threatened, right? We go back to a time before the United Nations, before these global institutions. That's not something that most of these leaders want. That's the messaging that, to my mind, would be more effective than portraying it as some kind of battle of good and evil or battle between democracy and authoritarianism or that kind of thing.
That's excellent. John, in the essence of time, I'm going to ask you to cover two questions that really go to the heart of Europe's engagement in this. And the first is Europe really contributing proportionally for resources and support? And we have heard a lot about the issue of armaments. Dmitry, you mentioned the Russians may have run out of armaments. We certainly have heard Ukraine is going through ammunition, at least at an exorbitant rate. Is Europe able to continue to backfill, or is that going to fall on the United States? And are they carrying their weight? Are they pulling their weight in this conflict?
To the question, how do the Europeans see their role, their contribution, their proportionality in the war and in support of Ukraine? I think one of the remarkable things that's emerged from the Ukraine war is a deeper recognition in Europe of the inadequacy of its defense position, posture, and forces. I mean, I think it's really sunk in ways that they just never faced up to before. They've even discovered, there was an excellent article this morning even about trying to get tanks to Ukraine and how difficult it is for the Europeans to get the tanks they promised there. They're discovering, among other things, that many of the tanks are not even very functional, the Leopard tanks. They're coming to a realization that not simply in terms of support of Ukraine, but in support of their broader requirements of their own security, they have got to up the game. And that the US is bearing, even more than before, a disproportionate part. So I think one of the things that's going to come out of this is a change in European conduct on defense policy and on defense posture. And I think this recognition is extending not only to the government, it's becoming stronger amongst the publics in Europe. But on the South, the global South, I just wanted to add one other thing this war has brought out for the West, if you will, for the US, for the Europeans, some others perhaps, is a perception of the attitudes of the South that they simply had not absorbed before. The war has brought about a whole new sense of sensitivity to that did not exist before.
It's increased our perspective and our awareness of issues that other countries' perspective are not necessarily all seen through the Western lens. So thank you for that. Dmitry, I'm going to let you close with our last minute and a half, and I'm going to shorten this sets of questions to with or Putin. Basically, where do you see the situation going in the Kremlin? He is obviously, as you said about COVID, operating out of fear of a lot of some rational, some irrational. But in your mind, what is the future of Putin, not only in Russia, but on the global world stage?
At this point, he doesn't see himself as losing. I'm sure there's some realization that things have not gone quite to plan, but he's still banking on, in the long term, having the staying power. Recent past history is that the West gets tired, the West gets divided. It doesn't have the staying power, right? In the end, Ukraine will still be next to Russia, and the West will have, run out of patience or whatever, and we'll make a deal, and then the profit motive will come back in, and they'll want to reconnect with the Russian economy. I think that's the long-term perspective. The longer that doesn't happen, the more strain it puts on the Russian system. There's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding of the sanctions regime. We haven't really talked about that too much. There was a possibility of sanctions back in March of 2022 actually causing economic collapse in Russia. Had to have been structured a little bit differently to actually do that in terms of cutting off oil and gas as well. But the main goal of the sanctions was to weaken Russia over time. And that, I think, is working, maybe not as fast as some hope, but it will put strain on Russia. And it will put strain on some of the circle around Putin. I think regime change is unlikely just because he's been selecting for loyalty for many years. So that's hard to change, but it's not completely excluded. I don't expect protests to destabilize the system or anything like that. but some change internally is possible. You know, for Putin, this is an existential war. So I don't think he's going to end it himself unless some of his terms are met. And even then, it may be a breather rather than a long-term decision to stop.
Thank you, Dmitry. And you definitely teed up an issue. I am working on putting together a program on the economics of Ukraine, both the economics of sanctions, but what the economics of eventual rebuilding will look like. And we're targeting that for later in the spring or early summer. So it's a situation we now need to look at retrospectively and prospectively as well. Thank you all for your patience and for being part of this program. I'm going to close with saying Slava Ukraine. It's been heart-wrenching to watch this war materialize over the last year. And we are very privileged here across the United States that many of us don't have to live and breathe the war every day, as Dmitry does, and John and Susan, I'm sure you will be too. But I'm glad that this group was willing to take your time and energy to listen to these issues. This is important that we all stay informed, and informed citizenry and civil discourse is the goals of National Security Forum and the goals of our community. So with that, thank you very much for being here. Stay tuned for our next program announcements. If you would really like to see a topic covered, please let me know, and I will let you know about our upcoming events. Take care, be safe out there, and Slava Ukraine. Take care.